This is a special session financed or hosted by the Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage Project, being run out of Simon Fraser University, and it's been coordinated by Lena Mortensen from University of Toronto and myself, with the input from folks that are on the Cultural Tourism Working Group.
So across the world, an increasing number of communities have embraced cultural tourism, as you probably know, as a means to strengthen or build local economies, to revitalize cultural traditions, and also as a complement to management of local cultural and natural resources. Countless examples show, of course, that tourism has really ambivalent effects. Some of the most destructive outcomes that we know about include environmental degradation, increasing income inequality, the breakdown of social structures that support communities, loss of privacy, and especially for IPinCH interests, unmanaged commodification of culture that unsettles local meanings of traditional practices and then makes them susceptible to unwanted appropriations. But from a more optimistic perspective, developing tourism, especially that's based around intangible cultural heritage of communities, is widely promoted as a means for building cross-cultural understanding. We heard a little bit about that already in a presentation. Preserving local heritage, promoting tolerance and mutual respect, and according to the World Tourism Organization, it even is contributing to conditions of world peace. The World Tourism Organization puts together this very optimistic statement about the kinds of things that tourism can do. It can stimulate economic growth and job creation, protect the environment and cultural legacy, promote peace, prosperity, and again, the respect for human rights. This is a pretty impressive list of potential outcomes, positive outcomes especially, and surely what motivates many to embark on developing cultural tourism. Hoping, of course, that the benefits are going to outweigh the alternatives, and that community tourism doesn't end up looking like this picture, which is sort of not usually what we want. Tipping the scales in that direction, avoiding this kind of a situation, however, requires close attention to the human dimension of tourism contexts, and this is where we want to direct our presentation today. So specifically, we want to focus on an issue that we think is very central to increasing the positive, beneficial dimensions of tourism, and that's an issue that lies at the heart of the industry and what we'll call the tourism encounter, and how to mediate that tourism encounter. So tourism is made up, particularly cultural tourism, is made up of close, often very intimate encounters between people face to face. And it's this intimacy that makes space for that kind of deep and meaningful connection of cultural exchange, but also for those surface misunderstandings that might lead to unwanted appropriations or offensive behavior, stereotyping, or other kinds of harms. The space of the tourism encounter, or the context in which hosts and guests and hosts and visitors or meet and interact, in which tourism activities take place, has been talked about in a variety of ways. For a long time, and still from some perspectives, people talked about tourism encounters in terms of impact. And that sort of brings up an image of one-way engagement, where tourists sort of descend upon a place and leave their mark. And then the host communities are just sort of passive recipients and subject to the tourist gaze. More recently, the tourist encounter has been approached as a kind of meeting ground, or even a space of mutual performance, where both hosts and guests sort of perform their expected roles. But what's clear from both analytical and practical perspectives is that tourism encounters are made up of really multiple parties that bring different sets of interests, and sometimes those interests are coming into conflict. What that means also is that tourism encounters are spaces of exchange. And so people who are participating in the tourism encounter are undertaking kind of a series of transactions. The most obvious transaction, of course, is the exchange of money for services or cultural goods or performances or other sorts of things that are related. But tourism can also involve other kinds of intangible exchanges, like the exchange of ideas or of hospitality, or maybe even acts of friendship or of values. While tourism encounters may often be intimate, they are never unmediated. And they're never really sort of one singular moment either. It's better instead to think about tourism a tourism encounter as building on a history of representation. So ideas and images and desires, what anthropologist Noel Salazar has referred to as a tourism imaginary. And these tourism imaginaries tend to inform what each party in the encounter expects or hopes to experience, and what each is going to anticipate from the other. And so given this, how tourism encounters play out is influenced very, very much by the knowledge that a visitor holds about the host culture, what they've encountered already before their visit. So that groundwork of the encounter is laid out well before the actual encounter takes place. So in this research, we want to focus on a particular mediator of that tourist experience, the tourism protocol, or guides for tourist behavior, which is really extremely important and increasingly influential layer of media that's shaping that encounter. We also share the perspective that members of host communities are not only actors in these moments of encounters, not passive recipients, but that they can be proactive in shaping the terms by which that exchange takes place and ultimately how those encounters play out. And so that's our starting point. Formal codes of conduct in tourism began in the 1960s as a response to the growth of mass tourism and some of those devastating effects that I mentioned at the beginning. Today, codes of conduct are very widespread. They're part of a growing interest in what's called responsible tourism or ethical tourism. They're on the parts of governments, private sector, international organizations, and on the parts of tourists themselves. Voluntary codes of conduct have been developed by a range of different kinds of groups for a range of audiences, including the World Tourism Organization, and it has a global code of ethics for tourism. But there's also principles that have been developed by private industry coalitions, and especially ones by NGOs, whose mandate is to promote sustainable and ethical tourism either regionally or internationally. Now, a considerable amount of these guides or principles are actually directed at tour operators themselves or other players in the industry. And there's also now available many more general codes or guides that are directed at potential visitors. But many of them are sort of generic about responsible travel, or they might treat a whole country in terms of what you should do or what you shouldn't. Many of these are now posted on places like TripAdvisor online under the heading of tips and etiquette that you might look up, or the section before you go, again sort of anticipating your travel. But they're again sort of usually listed at the level of a country destination. These macro level guides are also very important, but what we're interested in here today is sort of what happens at the community level. So for our purposes, we wanted to focus on tourism protocols that emerge from within communities and are addressed to the tourists that visit them, and especially ones that attempt to convey culturally specific etiquette, again, based on the assumption that value systems are not necessarily shared by hosts and their visitors. We see this as a very potentially useful source for understanding more about the tourism encounter. And rather than view these things as kind of regulatory documents or lists of rules, we think that protocols can be understood as sort of reflecting that complexity of values and expectations and norms that play out in the tourism encounter. So, this research project is also the outgrowth of a more general interest in understanding how intellectual property issues are encountered or addressed or reshaped in the context of tourism, and that's what the Cultural Tourism Working Group in the IPinCH project is trying to focus on. And so looking at tourism protocols is a pretty interesting angle for thinking about intellectual property, but it also allows us to ask more specific questions about how communities can engage with tourism development more on their own terms. And while these protocols, especially these more general guides, have been in existence for a long time, we still don't really know very much about how useful they are in particular communities, or how they're enforced, and especially how they're perceived by visitors and how they're actually followed, what sort of use they are. Now, we're not able to answer all of those questions in this preliminary research, but we're hoping to be able to do some more that's going to get at those specific questions. So in general, the research is based on these questions. First, What communities or groups are writing and producing these protocols? What subjects do they cover? What are tourists told to do or not to do? Where and how are they disseminated? How do people encounter them? And then, of course, how effective are they in helping to manage tourists in communities and to follow community norms? And then especially, how does the tourism encounter change as a result? Additionally, we wanted to sort of chart out how specific or directed these tourism instructions are, what kinds of things they characterize as sacred or restricted knowledge, and how they explain what it means to act in a culturally appropriate way. And then, of course, how do they conceive of visitors? Now I wanted to say that most of the research that I'm presenting actually has been conducted by my co-author, the research assistant for the Cultural Tourism Working Group, Kristen Dobbin. But also that this research is really in the initial stages, and a lot of what it suggests is ideas for future research as well. So initially, Kristen had assembled over 30 community-based and or indigenous tourism protocols from around the world, but ones that have online presence, and ones that are addressing sort of visitor expectations and etiquette in both specific and very general ways. And again, being interested in this initial stages of the tourism encounter means that we're interested in how these things are available to people. What channels are they available through? So most of the research, actually, essentially all of the research, has been taken place online. We're looking for things that are publicly available because this is the first step that potential visitors are going to take when they're researching a destination or thinking about doing some travel. They're going to look online, and so we looked online to try and take the vantage point of a potential visitor. What am I going to encounter about a tourism protocol out there? What am I going to encounter about what's an appropriate way to be or act in this particular destination. We're also hoping that these protocols could be used as a resource for other communities that are looking to develop something along the same lines. And so this analysis is trying to kind of group them and think about how they conceive of these different categories. So although we collected over 30, and there's plenty more out there as well, for the sake of this presentation, we're talking about the ones that you see here, because they are sort of good examples of things that are coming either from a community, developed by them, not on behalf of a community by an NGO, or by specific members of communities. The only exception to that is the last one, the do's and don'ts for tourists, how you can visit Myanmar responsibly, which we included because it's a really interesting kind of protocol in that it's presented as a kind of cartoon booklet, which is a very unique way of presenting information and possibly very effective. So these various protocols, they have a real range in the breadth, what they cover. Some of them are very informal. Some offer very subjective guidelines in general terms like respect our culture. Others are very specific and action-oriented with directions like stay clear of dance performers. So you've got very direct, specific guidelines there. Protocols also address a really wide range of subjects, a wide scope of subjects, including but not limited to photography, the land, ceremonial sites and events, appropriate dress and speech, burial sites, artifacts and ruins, restricted areas, greetings, expressions of sexuality and gender divisions, physical contact, authenticity in buying handicrafts, drug and alcohol consumption, what's considered aggressive behavior, public displays of affection, and both body and spoken language. So really a huge, huge wide scope. The intent of these community protocols ranges from sort of basic management of behavior to the actual mediation of cultural knowledge, which is a really sort of interesting part of that cultural encounter in tourism. But both of those extremes offer protection for intellectual property that relates to cultural heritage. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how some of these protocols begin to actually frame that tourist encounter. First, we have the idea of tourism as a privilege, or a privilege for whom. References to privilege and respect is very common in these protocols, though elements are framed in slightly different ways. For instance, in the Zuni Pueblo guidelines, tourism is said to be a privilege, while the Sapa community suggests that visits are an honor for the host. In similar vein, some of the guidelines are written about as a way to respect host culture. And another example is offered by the Myanmar Responsible Tourism Policy, which says, "We warmly welcome those who appreciate and enjoy our heritage, our way of life, and who travel with respect." Others suggest that tourism is the means for creation of mutual respect. For example, in the Sapa case, in the guidelines you have the statement, "You sometimes talk about ethnic tourism. We prefer to talk about mutual respect." Or in the Powwow Power guidelines, "Treat others as you would like to be treated." Now, referencing this kind of respect and mutual respect appeals to a very global sense of humanity. It might encourage visitors to think of local peoples not in terms of the objects of tourism, but rather as just like themselves. And instead of highlighting differences, this suggests a kind of closing of that gap of difference, or bridging worldviews, as we talked about yesterday. Next, we have mutual curiosity. We're thinking about tourism as exchange. And in this framing, it's generally suggested that curiosity about cultural difference is not just a one-way thing coming on the part of the visitor. So for instance, in the Sapa tourism guidelines, you have the statement, "You wish to get to know us, but we too have a lot to learn about your way of life and habits that sometimes seems just as strange to us as some of ours to you." And advice for the visitors into Indian country, visitors are asked to share with these hosts. The native people you meet are generally as interested as you are in them. Exchange information and experiences. So you're directed to exchange information and experience, which I also like. And again, here sort of local differences are highlighted within the protocol. But framing the tourism encounter as exchange in this very explicit way encourages tourists especially to consider the perspectives of the host community, and again works to sort of bridge that worldview gap. Justification is another set of issues that comes up in the guidelines. Some of the guidelines offer reason for the creation of the protocols themselves, in particular citing ideas of cultural misunderstanding. In the Sapa protocols, for instance, cultural misunderstanding is explicitly highlighted. So the sudden influx of tourists may have negative effects on our villages because many of our foreign guests are not aware of our sometimes complex customs. Certain attitudes or behaviors considered normal by you may be considered shocking here and create problems and misunderstandings on both sides. Drawing attention to these processes of cultural misunderstanding, then tourists are given kind of insights into the problems of the tourist encounter, which they may not be thinking about ahead of time. Different communities also offer various levels of justification or explanation for particular behaviors. So, for example, in some protocols, visitors are giving nothing more than the rule itself, don't do this or do that. But others try and explain the reasons behind the rule. So, for example, the Zuni protocol says to refrain from using drugs or alcohol, while the Sapa guidelines say drug consumption is forbidden here. We want to protect our youth from this terrible habit. Other protocols are also dealing with controlling the actions of tourists and refer to, again, action-oriented requests such as things like treading lightly on the environment, leaving burial sites undisturbed, forbidding collection of artifacts, asking permissions before taking photographs. And sometimes there's some justifications in a more general term, like these sites are sacred. But we might also have something more specific, like during feast days, please stay clear of the dancers because they symbolize a special honor for the occasion. So again, sort of bringing a little more insight into where these protocols are coming from. So sort of sum up thinking about justification a little bit. What they might do is to hopefully further encourage tourists to follow the protocols, giving a little bit of reasoning behind them. That sort of insight could help tourists understand why they're being asked to do something or not. But it also might encourage them to seek further information into a community before their next trip. A few more sets of ways to think about them in terms of cause and effect. Announce yourself before entering a house. We'd be happy to let you in. Ask permission before taking a photo. We'd be happy to grant it to you. Sort of, here's your, if you engage in this behavior, this is the effect it might have. This is another way of framing it. And then also we talk about context specificity. And this I think is a really important one. in that, and a big difference from some of the more macro tourism guidelines, saying that this is a kind of guideline that is specific to this community, but all communities are different, and you need to be looking for the differences everywhere. You can't just sort of take one guideline as a general one to think about ethical or responsible behavior. One of the initial things that we had begun to do also with these tourism protocols is not just looking at how they're framing the visitor experience or how they're similar or different, and giving some examples here, but then also how they are mediated online, sort of how information about them is communicated. And so I don't have time to go into all of it today. We were looking specifically at the guidelines from the Pueblo of Acoma, which is very well represented on TripAdvisor. And on TripAdvisor you have online forums where people are actually communicating about the guidelines that are available. And so people will get on and write about this destination and tell people, other potential visitors, here are some things that you should expect. Make mentions of some of the particular rules, and again sort of guiding those sets of expectations about what's going to happen in a cultural tourism encounter. For the most part, those are the actual guidelines. For the most part, people are saying these in a really neutral kind of, or even positive way, such that it suggests that people are expecting particular kinds of cultural restrictions, at least in this kind of a category. In a very few cases, you have much more ornery kinds of responses. So this one is from a person who is angry that they had to pay for the tour and needed a photography permit to visit the museum, where they could take pictures, where they couldn't. But this is actually really the minority of the kinds of responses to tourism protocols, at least for this particular destination. In fact, in more recent discussion on the online forum, when someone is posting a negative discussion about the tourism protocols, a bunch of other people weigh in and say, you don't understand, you're being disrespectful, and sort of actually kind of schooling the people who are putting up the negative things. While this kind of research about what's available online and how these things are framed can get us to a few points in thinking about mediating the tourism encounter, what we really hope is for someone to pick up an empirical project to be able to ask and answer those initial questions about how is this really working in a particular community. And so starting with especially a community that might want to develop a set of tourism guidelines, do some initial research about what expectations are from tourists at that point, and then working through the guidelines to see how they're actually affecting the encounter.